Hello, very beautiful community. The tyrant in the Kremlin is 73 this week. He has missed an opportunity to reintegrate himself with the West. He's stuck on the front lines in Ukraine. And he is kept in power as much by the resilience of Russia's weird political system as he is by his own endeavors, which are in many ways unsuccessful because he has psychically degenerated after a quarter century in power. Let's talk about this in a way that speaks to exactly what kind of challenge we're facing with the Kremlin right now. Now, Putin is expending an inordinate percentage of GDP and several 100,000 casualties annually to make advances on the front line that are actually invisible if you look at a map of Ukraine from a distance. Now, at this point, it's worth reminding us that, of course, while Putin is facing a difficult choice between the cost and shock of carrying on the war and the cost and shock of stopping the war, he's not fighting a territorial war in the first instance. That when he talks about territorial aspirations in Ukraine, these are secondary to and often a means to political goals such as ungovernability in Ukraine and democratic decline in the West, leading to the taking over of Western polities by post-truth authoritarian populists who share a kind of hyper-neoliberal fascicized monarchist ideology with Putin. So he is not after particular bits of territory as an end in itself. We are a long way into the war, but there is still this dominant misconception that this might be, on Putin's terms, a territorial war when it isn't. And interestingly, it's generally the case that we underestimate the degree to which the aspirations behind the military actions of the Russians are political. Think, for example, of the bombardment of civilians in Ukraine. The aim of that is actually contrary to their being talk of this war being genocidal. It is backed by some genocidal rhetoric. Much of Russia's rhetoric about Ukraine has been genocidal. But actually, the point of the attacks on civilians isn't genocidal at all. It's rather to get people in Ukraine to get fed up with the war and to get fed up with their own government, to destabilize Ukrainian politics further. The aim is terroristic, not genocidal, when it comes to bombardment of civilians in Ukraine. Of course, we'll soon be talking about Israel's activities in Gaza, where Israel has needlessly destroyed tens of thousands of lives, and we're talking about what the status of what Israel has done there is. So it'll be possible to make comparisons, but we won't do that now. So this is where he is, but he didn't need to be here in my analysis because he's just made and is continuing to make a very big mistake. I don't think it's the kind of mistake that he could have stopped himself from making, but it is nevertheless a mistake. And the mistake is this: constrained by an excess of caution and a kind of sublimation of imagination by fear, Putin failed to see or act on the fact that he could have used the Trump administration to partly reintegrate with the West. And that would have done much more damage to Ukraine and much more damage to the prospects of Western democracy than Putin might do by simply carrying on the war and ignoring Trump's invitation to be more agreeable with him. Was this even available as an option for Putin? In my view, no. He didn't think it, he didn't see it. But a more imaginative and fresh and mentally alive leader would have been much more attuned to that possibility as actually the best way of bringing about a kind of victory over the West, which for Putin is about the collapse of the kind of political system that he does not want to see in the West, the kind of political system that we want to maintain, often against many organic sources in our society that are counter-institutional, counter-constitutional, and trying to break our democracies. And of course, Putin is well aware that when that trend goes further, it's clear which kind of people are going to come to power. They're going to be people who are folks of ideological affinity to Moscow. Not because they have been brainwashed by Moscowite propaganda, but because there is a certain kind of ideological wash doing the rounds across the globe, of which Russia is just merely a very extreme victim. Now let's say a little bit about Putin's mental state. Having said a little bit about his mistake and a little bit about his predicament. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, you hear. Power co-opts, and absolute power co-opts absolutely, you also hear. And Russian power doesn't just co-opt and corrupt, it sends you potty. You already began to get glimpses of that with Yeltsin, who was much more institutionally checked than Putin. And eventually that began to happen with Putin. And here I want to say two things. One about how he started off and where he landed, and second about his mental state. Putin started off as a pro-Western leader. But he didn't start as a pro-Western leader because he believed in Western liberal democracy. He didn't even believe in Western liberal democracy in the West. He thought that it was just a facade. He never believed, even in 1999, in the idea of political opposition. The idea that opponents today could compete within the rules of a game which they both respect, and on another occasion even be allies. Right? Putin does not believe in politics as a game of tennis in which you follow the rules. He believes in it as a game of tennis in which you can take out your racket and throw it across the court and then grab other kinds of rackets and bats and balls from other sports and just throw them willy-nilly at your opponent until something happens. He just does not believe in relations of political opposition at all. And if you don't believe in that, you simply cannot even imagine what social possibility, what social space there could be available for any implementation of democracy in practice. So all democracy is just a sham and a nonsense. All political relations for Putin are relations of enemies or allies or traitors. There is no relation of political opposition. So, for instance, he sees Keir Starmer as an enemy and Volodymyr Zelensky as a traitor. Now, the reason Putin was pro-Western is, funnily enough, despite what I've just said, not entirely devoid of Western ideology. There were neoliberal materials in the way Putin admired the West. That's to say, he admired the West not for democracy, but for power. And power for Putin was money. The West had power because the West had money. And that disposition of Putin's began to break a few years into his first term. You shouldn't exaggerate how pro-Western Putin's first term was, because in many ways it looked more pro-Western than it was, because he was on a kind of a default mode, carrying on certain patterns from the Yeltsin administration, which he already knew he didn't like and wouldn't carry on in his second term. But what we did in Iraq, what we did in Afghanistan, the weakness we showed there, the weakness we showed in the financial crash of 2008, changed Putin's mind and began to convince Putin that the West was, in a kind of Fukuyamian in reverse way, on a pattern of irreversible decline. So he moved from a kind of anti-democratic pro-Western position to a position of conviction about our demise. Not our demise into societal collapse, but our demise into democratic collapse. Let me say something about his mental state. There are a lot of videos on the main channel in particular about Putin's mental state, including one from a couple of years before the start of the full-scale invasion. I'll link that up below, but I want to link up at the end of this video to a specific video in the main channel, which I did 2 or 3 years ago, where I traced Putin's evolution across the terms in power that he negotiated from a quarter of a century to now. Don't underestimate on his mental predicament how psychically broken Putin is. This is not the point that Putin is mad or he's a nutcase. In fact, he's extremely thoughtful, extremely considerate. And when it comes to a sort of means to end rationality, right, how do I get from A to B, he's probably more systematically reflective than Keir Starmer or Macron. So he's not an idiot, and he's not a madman. But he is psychically broken, and he is, in my analysis, controlled more by a network of neurotic fears than by any kind of grand strategy. So he's a loser. He's mentally a loser. He is mentally lost. This is not a vindication of the early Putin, as I've said. Putin was a corrupt authoritarian before he came to power. But this is a commentary on the fact that we tend to underestimate how extraordinarily distorted human psyche gets when it sustains itself in power for a long time, when it sustains itself in unchecked power for a long time, and when it sustains itself in unchecked Russian power for a very long time. And so Putin has a lot of tricks up his sleeve that he has practiced over many years that help him go on. He also has very considerable talents, right? We won't ventilate all of that. But what I want to say is that his mental decline, psychological decline rather more than mental decline, is a liability. And that he is in good part in power, not so much because of his enormous skill and mastery over political forces in Russia, but because Russia's very bizarre, strange, hybrid political system, in many ways resembling a sort of a mafia organization, in many ways relying on fairly decent and reliable types of state capacity. But Russia's political system, which is a very strange and paradoxical kind of animal, keeps ticking. It's the surprising and bizarre reliability of that political system and its capacity to tick over no matter how you throw it around and what you throw at it, that is in good part keeping Putin in power. And it's that political system that might outlive some Western democracies, whatever happens to Putin. But of course, it's our job to make sure that that does not happen. Lots of love.